big picture, the issue of does Wall Street drive sort of short-term thinking is absolutely correct. And you have this broader sort of trend where you have these massively large and complex organizations that are building some of the literally largest and definitely most complex sort of items in the world, like when it comes to airplanes or the other military hardware that sort of Boeing sort of does. And what happens in that case is you can't have sort of like the founder-led sort of ethos of sort of a company like this, beyond the fact it's a relatively old company at this point, but like no one person can do it all. You need sort of like management and to sort of do this sort of well and at scale. One of the challenges, though, and this doesn't apply to Boeing, this is a broader sort of observation, is that managers are divorced from the ownership, long-term value of a company. Now, we try to fix this with management theory by incentivizing them with stock, for example, and they get options or whatever it might be, and that's part of their compensation plan. The problem is those are valued and paid off on an annual basis. And so the net effect is, even while trying to fix this problem, by and large, it's still like a 1-year incentive cycle. Maybe for a CEO, it'll be 4 or 5 years. No one's compensated on a 20-year sort of investment cycle. And that's sort of a challenge there. So you're like, well, but the stock market does that. Well, theoretically, yes. But, the stock market,
human.
Well, not only that, but the stock market is also run by this sort of managerial class. You and I are not sitting around making individual stock purchase decisions like Fidelity is, right? Or whatever it might be. And so you have this aspect of these, you have a management class investing in a management class, both of whom are incentivized on short-term returns, right? Like how did this mutual fund do over the last year? You have the people who put the money in the mutual funds or even into hedge funds, things like that they could pull their cash. Well, actually, leave aside the hedge funds at the moment. So you have basically short-term incentivized investors investing in short-term incentivized sort of managers,
leadership, and also a lot of employees, just for the record, because you're bringing a lot of people in with stock packages, and people can, when I say people are human,
right?
People can see when the stock takes a beating for a year, because
even if they're not stock
long-term
incentivized, they're worried about their paycheck, right? And so they're going. You get all these sort of incentive sort of issues, and this is just a big problem with big companies and big complexity. You need the companies to be big because it's a very complex world. You scale matters in so many of these different areas. But you're going to have, it's structurally inevitable. You're going to have short-term prioritization and a decrease in sort of very long-term sort of issues. So just the whole model is kind of fundamentally flawed in that regard. Now, I mentioned hedge funds. Hedge funds get a lot of bile because you have but important to the hedge fund model is they get the investors to put the money into the hedge fund. They lock up that money. They're like, you have to give this money for a 10-year period. And same thing with venture capital. Like when you put that's sort of on the opposite side, building new companies as opposed to like rehauling old ones. In both cases, it's actually really important to understand that they're putting in capital for the long run, because at least on the investor side, now you have someone that can actually look to execute a strategy over a number of years. And what they do is, now this is not happening on the company side. It's actually happening on the investor side. So what they will do is they will go in and they will restructure effectively the incentives for the managers to increase their profitability, increase their growth, whatever it might be. Now, the easiest levers to pull, particularly for someone that is short-term incentivized structurally, is to cut costs, is to sort of strip things down, is to sort of produce more profit, more earnings per share. And what sort of happened was there was tons of money to be made by hedge funds and activist investors in particular 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
A lot of companies responded to that pressure by basically acting like activists and hedge funds and cutting unilaterally cutting, increasing profitability, all these sorts of pieces. And so you've had almost like this activist increased profitability mindset that has taken over all companies, because they don't want the activists to come in and do it themselves, because part of the activists coming in and taking over is firing all the management. So the management is sort of more incentivized to do this. Now,
and making the same cuts anyways.
Now, so all this is true. And I think there's this sort of broad agreement that this is sort of a challenge for these big companies. Here is where I actually differ with a lot of people who raise these arguments. I think by and large, this is actually a good thing, because I think all these issues and challenges and the struggle for innovation and building new things is inherent to big old companies. And so actually, I'm fine with getting money out of these companies as rapidly as possible so that that money can be redirected into new companies, into new opportunities, into founder-led companies that are not that are operating in a different world. To take Apple, for example, which is obviously a very large company, but they've been operating in markets that are massively growing. And so it's like ESPN back in the day. They can invest sort of in a way for the next 10 to 15 years because they know there's going to be so much money to be made in 10 to 15 years. And the market is sort of rewarding them for the possibility of making money in 10 to 15 years. And in a lot of these other companies, there's this mismatch. People who want to complain about short-termism. It's like, what's the actual short-term future for this company, right? You want them to create the future. Why should they create the future versus a startup creating the future that's unbound by all this bureaucracy, all this sort of incentive issues, all these sorts of issues? And there's this mindset that people want, companies ought to live forever. They ought to do sort of new things. Why? No, obviously new things should be done. It's not clear it should be the old companies that doing it. And in fact, for all these structural reasons, the faster these companies die off, we actually want to accelerate the sort of demise of these old companies. Because the money's fungible. Get the money out, put it in something else. Let that company grow large, produce a ton of cash, take that money out, put it in the next thing. That is actually how things should work. And the real problem with Boeing in this sort of analysis is not that Boeing went sideways. It's that Boeing is so locked in for regulatory issues, defense contract issues, all these sorts of things. They basically have a monopoly type power and position in the world, not from their own good work, but because they're good at operating politically, because they, like the defense, the Pentagon will write a contract, or Boeing will help the Pentagon write a contract that only Boeing can fulfill. And now suddenly they're a national security dependency, right?
Well, not only that, I mean, look, they've had the worst week ever. And honestly, you could expand the scope and say they've had a really rough 5 years here. And yet Airbus can't make enough airplanes to serve the demand around the world. So people are still going to be buying Boeing no matter what happens, because there are basically two companies that can serve this market.
That's right. That's right. And for lots of reasons, it's really hard to build a new airframe, not because we don't know how to do it, but because all the regulatory challenges that come in building it. Like this is the reason why regulation in the short term, it makes lots of sense, but there's a real long-term cost, which is we have this structural challenges with large companies in the very long run. And what we're doing is we're basically making those companies can never die, when that's exactly what we want to happen. The talent should be able to flow to a new company along with the money. Like, we're not asking people to be fired. We're not asking for aerospace engineers to be out of work. We're asking them to work for a company that actually has a good culture and is growing and has an opportunity. And instead, you're just sort of stuck with these sort of players.